The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast, in which the host puts random emphasis on some of the words when he introduces it. I am Greg, who I think remembers what this podcast is about, despite the quality of this introduction. And joining me is Tylor, who sure as hell better understand what this podcast is about.
I'll be honest, I'll know that I understand what this is about, but I cannot promise I will say things any better than you just did. As far as I'm concerned, that's like a B+ grade on the curve. Let's keep going kind of introduction. So solid
that is
work.
Tylor speak for, hey, dummy, I'm not starting this over. Keep going. So I will by saying that we are very excited to be joining you again. We are back on the main show, which we are now really having as the only show for a while, because we're just doing book talk for the foreseeable future. As we have said, in August, as a special treat, we did 4 episodes that covered the first season of the Wheel of Time television program. And Tylor has instructed me that I should not watch season 2 until he can watch it and make sure it doesn't spoil anything from later books in some kind of tragic way. So we'd love feedback on those episodes, and we hope you enjoyed them, but don't be looking for more of them.
Yeah, those will happen at some point. But for those of you who have read the books, there is one moment at the very end of the last episode of the Amazon show that makes me go like, oh, they might be going in book 4 directions. So I need to watch this before anyone who cares about spoiling the books actually watches along. We will try to get you Amazon episodes about season 2 as soon as we can do so without spoilers, is my plan at least. But let's leave all of that television show stuff behind and interrupt Greg as he leaned forward. Okay, he put up his finger. He can talk.
Now I'm saying, and listeners can guess which finger. Leave it all behind, except to say, as we do whenever it comes up, pay your writers and your actors.
100%.
The end. Now let's talk about, hey, you know what? Speaking of me holding up fingers that they can't see, what a stupid thing to do on a non-visual medium. Why don't we have another visual discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast?
I am so glad that you introduced that today when you are struggling to deliver words. That was perfect. Yes, this week we have a non-visual discussion, or a visual, whatever it is, that one.
Who named that segment? That's terrible. Yeah, move on.
We will be today discussing the icon on chapter 21, A World of Dreams. And this icon, as Greg described it, is a swirly thing before we were on air. And it's a circle. It's mostly black and white. And it kind of looks almost as if there is a white segment that is kind of wrapped around a black segment, and the black segment is also wrapped around the white segment. I am trying not to say what it is because I want to see Greg have to guess what it is before I tell him, and it's kind of a really straightforward answer. Greg, what do you think of this symbol, and what do you think it symbolizes?
I'm so glad you described it visually, because usually that falls to me and I have no idea what to say. So thank you for that one. I from time to time, I like to elevate our podcast by mentioning some kind of cinematic masterpiece, hence previous discussions on Back to the Future 2, and other just terrible films. So I will say that...
Whoa. If there were other things on that list, I could let that go. But your introduction was Back to the Future 2 and other terrible films. That's just not true. Continue.
Fair enough. What came to mind first when I saw this, actually when I would turn the page to read it, more than just tonight, is I immediately thought of the cinematic masterpiece, A Muppet Christmas Carol, and particularly when they go to the Ghost of Christmas Future, and they use a very, I'm going to say mid-90s, early computer graphics effect.
Yeah.
What it is reminiscent of is when Home Improvement would have the weird bumpers between their scenes where there is a giant swirl and everything, was like a still photo of the background of the scene, and it swirls entirely to become a tunnel through which Scrooge can be led by the ghost. And then as they arrive, it unswirls the new background in a very I need to stretch out my PowerPoint slide presentation manner.
It is 100% how George Lucas would have been transitioning between scenes if he had been making movies during that era. It was the wipe of its time. I 100% know what you are describing because that is the best of the Muppet movies, which need to continue, by the way. We need more movies where Muppets play all of the roles except for one.
It's so easy to just adapt a work of literature. Like, it's so easy. Just keep doing it. Disney, come on, give us a call. So in Real Answer World, I will say I believe this would be the Terror Angrial that Egwene is given. I really had to look at my notes to see which Angrial it was, and I almost hit on Teleron Rioid. Spoilers for our discussion in like 2 minutes. But it appears to be the charm that she was given in order to, it was said that it eases the passage into the dream world, which snooze fest on the dream world, but pretty cool icon, as it were.
Absolutely correct. What does this chapter icon symbolize? Literally, we are seeing the ring that Egwene was given that allows someone to pass into the world of dreams. In terms of what does this represent at the beginning of a chapter, generally speaking, it will either be the use of that artifact or just anyone who is entering into the world of dreams at any point. So when you see this, typically, I think this would probably go along with Egwene using this ring in order to go into the world of dreams. But as time goes on, you'll start to see it more generally, just to be, if the world of dreams is involved, this could be the symbol that pops up. I really like this symbol in part because of something you've already described. Is I don't know that I would have jumped immediately to Muppet Christmas Carol, but this feels very much like simultaneously the ring itself and kind of a portal into the world of dreams, right? It feels like it's kind of opening up in the middle almost. And you get that sense of movement from this image. And all of that is to say, this works. Like, some of these symbols are a little too simple for me. Sometimes I'm like, this is like bad heraldry. That is not the case here. This is just a really solid chapter icon as far as I'm concerned.
Completely agree. And I realize now, looking at it, that a real man probably would have referenced James Bond instead of Muppet Christmas Carol. But this is the new masculinity, baby. Get used to it. Weird man, children. So what I will note in light of what you just said is that it is an image that could be very much balanced between white and black. You have the white center and the black corners, and then the two pieces in the middle are roughly equivalent or close enough, except for the fact that the white portion of the central ring has some cross-hatching on the top and bottom. So to me, it's very striking that while this very easily could have been essentially a play on the yin-yang type symbol we've seen before, it purposefully misses that. And it makes me feel like while it is white in the middle, it is, which would make you think it's like a power of the light, it feels tinged with darkness. And that makes me nervous. Also nervous that we're just going to see a whole bunch of this dream world thing.
Just remember what we learned in the chapter. Dreamworld isn't all bad. It's kind of like Inception, Greg. We like some movies related to dream things. I actually have no idea if you like Inception or not. I may be pitching you on the worst movie in your opinion. I have nothing else to say about this chapter icon. This is a podcast that works best when I give large blocks of text in a row. So I think it's obviously time for my chapter summary of chapter 21, A World of Dreams. Unless you have any final thoughts.
I wrote a transition for that. So scratch that out, edit, pause, clap my hands. Tyler, I think that's enough of that discussion. Get out of my dreams and into my chapter summary.
Okay, you win. That's a much better transition. In a world of dreams, Egwene laments that she is already doing all of the chores, and then she remembers that Verin has summoned her to her quarters, which are located above the library. Verin's office is exactly like mine. It is piles of books and wild things everywhere, and I don't have an owl, but I kind of wish I did. Um, Egwene arrives and at first is given a puzzle in the form of an ancient kind of slip of paper that has some prophecy on it. I'm sure we will talk about that. And then Verin abruptly kind of changes the subject, gives Egwene all of the information on the Black Aja sisters, as well as information on all of the Terangrial that were taken. Egwene takes it, and immediately there's kind of a tense moment where she is suspicious of Verin and whether she's withheld any information. And once again, Verin kind of deflects any questions about this by changing the subject again, this time to Egwene's dreaming. She says that Verin thinks that Anaya is actually more convinced that Egwene is a dreamer than she's previously let on. And she explains kind of how the world of dreams, Teleran Riyadh, works. And she uses it by first starting with an explanation of the portal stones and then talking about how worlds can intersect other worlds and talking about how the world of dreams is a world that intersects all of the worlds that a portal stone could potentially touch. Verin basically then decides, okay, I'm going to give you this ring. She gives her the ring that we have just been discussing in the discussion of the chapter icon, explains that it can help someone pass into the world of dreams, especially if they already have the ability to do so, and says that this ring was once in the possession of the last dreamer in the tower, Corianin Nidal. She said that she used it to enter the world of dreams often. Verin says that she once tried and she still bears the scars. She shows them to Egwene. Finally, Egwene leaves and we get a Verin POV, the rarest of the POVs. She apparently has the notes of the last Aes Sedai who was a dreamer, and she both considers destroying them and considers going back on her original plan and giving them to Egwene, and decides to do neither, and then immediately forgets about all of that. So that's a chapter. I probably described way more of it than anyone needed because it's a Verin chapter, and that's what I do. Greg, what was your impression of this? In my edition, like 5.5, 6 pages.
Well, Tyler, you may say that I'm a dreamer, but I don't think I'm the only one. And I hope someday that you join me. This was a great chapter.
That one was fine.
There are so many dream lyrics. Get ready. You know which one's coming from our old days playing a certain board game.
Oh yeah.
So I thought this was a great chapter. And joking aside, you know, we've kid a lot about how I don't like dreams in books, and this has become kind of a part of this. Well, one of the great things here is there's no dreaming. They are talking about it. But the second part that's good is it actually kind of authorized more dreaming because what's there is real and it matters. And so it felt to me, you know, it's almost to the answer to a question I wasn't asking, but in a fun way. It's like I wasn't thinking so much about all this emphasis on dreams so far as one of the things I wanted the resolution to. But now that I understand a little better why Moraine has always been thinking about dreams, what this space is where Beelzemon talks to all the boys and Egwene at different times, but certainly primarily Rand. So now it gives a little better insight into that. It felt like a big expansion of the mythology in a lot of ways. So that to me all works pretty well.
Yeah, I think that one thing that works really well here is that it is an expansion of the mythology, and what Robert Jordan does is he scaffolds it on top of other pieces of the mythology, right? The fact that we get a discussion of the portal stones, and I think even a brief mention of the ways as being sort of like another world kind of like this. I think that does a really good job of, like you're saying, really expanding kind of the magic in the world that we have, but letting you kind of access it in a way that's like, okay, this fits. I see how the pieces kind of come together. One of the things that really bothers me a lot in fantasy is often like, it's book 5. Here's this new magic thing that we've never heard of before. And so the fact fact that Robert Jordan is able to do that in a way that makes it feel kind of like it belongs with everything else, I think assuages that worry that I have anytime some like new magic-y thing gets introduced. And I really appreciate that. I think in general, I was kind of curious about how you would react to the World of Dreams, because I knew dream sequences weren't your thing, but I wasn't sure if like the you can die in the dreams would be kind of the motivation that you needed to be like, okay, this feels real instead of dreamish. And it sounds like your answer is, at least like hypothetically based on this discussion, yes, you're a little more invested in the dream stuff than you were before.
Yeah, and I think I can, as we unpack some of this, try to explain to you why that is while simultaneously trying to summarize some of what's here for people that well, as I always do, I pretend it's for our listeners, but it's like, let me make sure I understood what's going on here and
Totally.
interpreted this right. So I do think, and just to the point you were just making, there's a thing that happens in almost all series and film series, book series, comic series of like power creep. And it's like, we've done everything interesting with whatever the hero's abilities are. So we're going to add another, and we're going to add another. Again, our beloved Star Wars did this literally constantly. I think there's not a single Star Wars movie that doesn't add a power to the Jedi in some regard. And so I think you're right that can feel rough when you're in book 3 and it's like, okay, time to introduce some other piece of mythology, some other part of this world. It's not power creep here necessarily as much as it is just like world creep or world expansion. But it had such a strong foundation in what we already understood. I certainly wasn't kind of skeptical of it, or I never questioned that it was a retcon. It felt like having the next piece revealed, not having the next piece created.
Well, and I think this is something that Robert Jordan is really gifted at, is I, as a reader, can never tell when something is kind of a half retcon and when things are not. And as someone who now has read some of the books that people have written based on the notes that Robert Jordan took, there are now things in the series that I'm like, oh, that was a retcon, but it actually worked so well, I never would have picked up on it. And I'm not sure if that is the case with this moment, but it kind of feels like it very well could be, right? Robert Jordan was just doing dream stuff in the first book because it was creepy and fit. And now he's like, oh, the world of dreams can be an even more effective way of doing this kind of like portal stone stuff because it touches our world in some way. We're talking a lot about the world of dreams. I actually want to step back just a little bit, because prior to the discussion of the world of dreams in the chapter, we get 2 other kind of quick hits from Verin in her discussion with Egwene. The first of which is a bit of scholarship that Verin is doing. She shares kind of a very brief excerpt from a work that she says some of the ancient scholars says was one of the most significant pieces of work. And she says that it was said to hold secrets that were important to the world, right? And so this is that. Just because it's hyped up so much, I think it's important that we talk about it briefly. It said, "Heart of Dark, Baal-Zaman, name hidden within name, shrouded by name, secret buried within secret, cloaked by secret. Betrayer of hope, Ishamael betrays all hope. Truth burns and sears. Hope fails before truth. A lie is our shield. Who can stand against the heart of the dark? Who can face the betrayer of hope? Soul of shadow, soul of the shadow, he is," and it ends there. Thoughts, Sir Greg?
Prophecies. The only thing worse than dreams. I mean, I kid somewhat, but that was kind of my reaction. I'm like, okay, so here's Robert Jordan being very clever by telling us what he's going to do 3 books from now, but not actually telling us. And what's interesting about those from my perspective, and it's not the, Min flashes operate in a similar fashion, is that I feel like he doesn't take the victory lap when something comes true, right? We kind of get these shards of prophecy, and then you'd expect like something happens to Rand, and Matt would be like, oh, wow, that was blah, blah, blah. And he never does that, which I think is kind of respectful to readers and lets a rereader kind of really see those pieces laid earlier. So I assume you don't have a lot to say about it because you know exactly what a lot of that refers to. But to me, it's like, okay, we're going to learn more about this eventually. Sounds good. I'll wait till then.
All that I want to highlight about this is that it's almost like a stanza, right? It's a bunch of like paired phrases, and all of those phrases are flips of each other, basically, right? It's like soul of shadow, shadow of the soul, or something like that. And the only two characters who are mentioned in this are Baalzamon and Ishamael. And so I just want to be putting those two names kind of next to each other. And for those of you who want like the Cliff Notes version of this without giving anything away, just keep in mind Baalzamon is the name of the individual who has been visiting Rand and the others in their dreams. And we learned from Moraine that Baalzamon is both the name of the Dark One in the Trolloc script and also potentially the name of someone simply using that name who is a lieutenant of the Dark One. Ishamael is a name that we have heard thrown around a couple of times. That was the individual who first off, this is a Forsaken. Second, this was considered kind of one of the greatest of the Forsaken, or the evilest of the Forsaken, if you will. And finally, Ishamael, we learned a couple of books ago, is actually another name for the character who we saw all the way back in the prologue of the Eye of the World, the one who was tormenting the dragon back in the ancient days. So I just want to kind of get those two names, if they're getting mentioned here in like big prophetic terms, we should at least know kind of who the cast of character being introduced here is, even if the rest of it, you're right, I think is kind of indecipherable until we get a little bit more detail.
Two responses to that is I'm glad to have that update. I could not remember who Ishamael was, but I was like, I know we talked about Ishmael from Moby Dick a bunch, so I know he's been mentioned before. Second thing is you opened up the opportunity for me to teach one of my favorite terms for a rhetorical device, which is, and this is a word, one of those words I've only ever read, not said, but I believe it's chiasmus, which is that kind of sentence structure you're talking about with these couplets where you have the phrase and then you kind of invert the phrase. So if I were teaching chiasmus, I would use JFK. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Yep. And that has a similar rhythm to that. And so there you go, listeners. Your page-a-day calendar is chiasmus, a type of rhetorical device that is, I mean, and to build off that, it's fun, right? Yep. And even when you're reading that prophecy, like that is it's definitely more of like clever wordplay than it is beautiful poetry, I would say. It's meant to be appreciated a little bit. And I appreciate those lines as a part of that. In all the lines you read, the one that is most interesting to me is the part about the name within a name within a name. And I'm curious to see how that comes to be. We have a lot of these words with kind of big apostrophe syllables, and it's like, well, it brings to mind Star Wars, how Thrawn, I don't know if you or Steph, our former guest of the show, is familiar with Steph's favorite character is Thrawn, but Thrawn, Grand Admiral Thrawn is actually named Mithrandu. I missed like 10 syllables in that, and they take the core name as their name, so it kind of feels like Baalzamon is like the long version, and we're going to narrow it down to a smaller version of that. Or perhaps it is hidden within a longer word or some such. That's what came to mind.
Well, and I think it's worth noting, as you mentioned, kind of some of these like big, long hyphenated words. One of the things that Verin highlights is that this is translated from the Old Tongue, and it was translated from the Old Tongue into the High Chant, and then from the High Chant into kind of the more common way of speaking. So it's worth noting, like, this is like reading a broken 14th century Old English transcript, right? Things are going to be wrong. And especially when you get poetic language like this, I feel like this is something that I've learned. I never took like deep dives into ancient Greece, but whenever I've read about like translating ancient Greek, it's always like, well, the problem is you're not getting the Greek. You're getting the Greek translated into Latin, translated into whatever that is then translated into English. And so you're losing all of the nuance. And so it feels like as you're reading this, it's like, oh, I could have lost a lot of nuance in this, and maybe I'm only getting part of the story. And I think that just works really well. Another one of my favorite fantasy series is Malazan Book of the Fallen, and that is written by an archaeologist, so he kind of nails this in a way that Robert Jordan hints at here. But I always think about it now since I've read that series in the past. I've now rambled about old books that Verin wanted to talk about long enough. What are your thoughts either on the one other quick hit here, which is Verin of the Black Aja, or any final thoughts on the World of Dreams? Because I know that we had kind of started and then halted that conversation.
Gosh, the order of them is tricky. Let's save the Verin conversation for the end of this chapter, because that is my final note on this chapter. So, I really thought the mythology dump worked well for me, and this actually will pick up on the Ishmael tip, as I have talked before on the show about how one of my favorite things in Herman Melville's Moby Dick is this idea of the universe being a combination of forces that is built through a weaving. And we get that metaphor deployed again here in a much more complex way than we've seen it before. And yet it works really, really well that, she mentions that the wheel is creating, the strands and become the pattern, like a piece of cloth, and then the cloth becomes lace, right? And I've already mangled that up. But the layering of this, I think it became very clear. I'm sure the show will do a chalkboard moment, right? Where it's like, here are the lines, the parallel lines as represented by the portal stones. And here we have the things that cut across those, right?
Yeah, but what's the dot above the I?
I was going to say it's just like Doc Brown saying, and then it spills down into this timeline in Back to the Future 2. So very good. We're hitting all our favorites. So it feels like that, and I really liked that. And I also liked the idea of calling it lace instead of fabric. And I think about the difference between those two things. Fabric is whole cloth, right? And whereas lace is intricate, it's delicate, it's more fragile, and it has a lot of blank space within it, right? Where there's no strands as a part of that. Visit your grandmother's house if you're not sure what we're talking about. And so the one other piece then, well, let me pause there. So did I get that largely right? Any complaints, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think the only thing I would add is that Verin adds an extra intricacy to the metaphor that I think you laid out really, really well here, which is at the end of her discussion, Verin doesn't just say, and then the world, it kind of gets laid out in what I think either here or later on will be referred to as the lace of ages, or the age lace. But then Verin kind of says, oh, but what if each of those is a world? And since the worlds are intersecting with each other, what if that weaves together to make some weave of worlds? And I was like, okay, that's a little too much like high thoughts for me. But in general, like I think Verin kind of takes that metaphor and pushes it in a way that is going to make us ask questions going forward.
It reminds me of cinematic masterpiece I Heart Huckabees, where I believe it's Marky Mark and Dustin Hoffman have a fight, where Dustin Hoffman is explaining how everything is connected, and if you look at two particles, in between them are smaller particles that touch and smaller, and Marky Mark is just standing there going like, but between those are a smaller space and a smaller space and a smaller. It's like that kind of multiplying of this idea to the infinite is just like beyond our capacity to understand. And it actually is a Janet moment. Janet can do it, right? And Janet has it all at her fingertips. We are moving too fast for listeners. Janet, who's not a robot from The Good Place, who exists in The Good Place but taps into the knowledge of the entire universe, which is very similar to how we are meant to now understand the creator and the Dark One, which is the other piece I wanted to pick out from this description. What came to mind in this moment, just to keep throwing the references hot and fast, is WandaVision, and how at the end of the WandaVision television show, they explain that the Scarlet Witch is a nexus being, so that there are some entities that exist in every universe of the Marvel multiverse, and the Scarlet Witch is one of them. Now, the difference here, I was like immediately like, these are Nexus beings, but the difference is there's only the one, right? It's not every universe has one. There is one Dark One and there is one creator, and they are constantly battling it out. And if that's not the Matrix Reloaded, I don't know what it is.
Yeah. I think what worked for me in this section is Verin lays out this like very complicated thing that makes me 8 times go like, that doesn't work. And then anytime Egwene points out a paradox, her answer is like, yeah, but the Dark One is paradox. And I'm like, okay, so it's timey-wimey. I'm kind of okay with that, right? As you were describing Verin kind of like infinitely multiplying either upward or downward kind of the scale, it immediately made me think, is it Terry Pratchett who had like everything is on the back of a turtle, and then when you ask what is the turtle on the back of, it's turtles all the way down? Like, that's kind of where I'm at some point. Once you understand one level of the cosmology, it can go as far as you want. It doesn't matter. And that's kind of where I'm at with this. It's interesting, it's worth thinking about, but I don't know how much it actually informs the story as much as it is like a cool metaphor that we get to talk about a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, everything we've just described, this is, I mean, we were joking, but we love The Good Place. We love, these types of mythologies. I even have a lot of affection for The Matrix Reloaded, which is definitely not something I would say on the internet. But I do think that makes this all really fun to play with and makes me really excited.
We have spent almost a half hour on a 6-page chapter. So I'm going to make you speed round. What are your thoughts on Verin and her allegiances? And then we can jump to the next chapter.
Reading verbatim from my notes, I went, I love Verin. This is very suspicious. Oh no, she's innocent. Oh no, she's way, way innocent. And essentially what that is those are the inverses of what you're supposed to think, right? Yep. We trust her right away. It's like, okay, she must be suspected. She then acts a little suspicious, like, okay, she must be innocent. And then the last piece, the perspective from her POV, it's like she's acting so suspicious. I can only say this is a red herring. She has to be trustworthy. I think she's good at this time.
Excellent. Anytime that that Verin makes you think, is she good or bad, and you switch your opinion 3 times in a chapter, that's a good Verin chapter as far as I'm concerned. That's why I love that character. Let's hop over to chapter 22, The Price of the Ring. As Egwene is making her way out of Verin's study, she is met by Sheriam, who has been looking for her. Sheriam says that she has been summoned immediately to be tested, to be raised to the accepted. There is no putting it off. She must come now. Egwene travels quickly and gets just a brief description of what to expect from Sheriam. When she arrives, Egwene is kind of surprised by who is there. She notes that there are a number of kind of powerful Aes Sedai, including Elida, and Elida is snippy. She is mad that Egwene was late. She seems upset about every potential delay. And eventually Egwene is told that in order for the test, she needs to be naked because Robert Jordan is writing as a man, I guess, in the 90s in particular. And Egwene gets really worried, both because she is worried that they will see the ring, which she is not strictly speaking supposed to have, and she is worried that they will see the notes on the Black Aja. And so if there are any women who are of the Black in this area, they would potentially know that she is out looking for them. Eventually, she kind of hides the stuff under her clothes and goes through the first of the arches to be tested for the accepted. Through the first arch, Egwene is in the 2 rivers. She is married to Rand. She has a daughter named Joya, and Rand comes home and begins telling of the news that he has heard of the Shan and the war and all of the bad things that are happening. We learn that Rand has been getting headaches and that his condition has been getting worse and worse. He starts to get a headache. Egwene thinks that she needs to heal him in the way that she kind of miraculously does sometimes. And then the star and arch appear, and she walks through it, abandoning Rand. She arrives back in the hall of the tower. She asks if it's real. She gets the same answer from Sheriam that we got when Nynaeve went through this, and then she goes through the second arch. She is now in the palace of Andor, but it is in ruins. There are Trollocs and Murdrail everywhere, and Rand is trapped beneath a large amount of rubble. He's saying he can't move it himself because he is not able to channel at the moment without risking going mad. pad. He asks Egwene to move it, but she is unable to. And then he says he is afraid because there are enough Aes Sedai and Myrddrail here that he could be turned to the dark. She begins to try to help him, and then there is the star and the arch, and she goes through. At this point, Egwene is back, and she begins asking about if someone can be turned to the dark. And Sheriam is kind of surprised by this question, but says, yes, in theory, it is possible. If there were 13 Aes Sedai and 13 Myrddrail, that would be able to force someone to turn to the dark. Egwene notes that is how many Black Aja left the tower, and she is basically kind of brushed off and sent through for the third time. Egwene then is the Merlin seat. She is greeted by Beldine of the Green Aja, who is her keeper. They are called to the hall of the chamber, and Beldine is really nervous and scared. When Egwene arrives, she finds that the hall of the tower is already in session, and when she kind of calls them to order, they bring in Rand in chains. He is charged with being a false dragon. Egwene is told to still him or gentle him, as is the punishment for being a dragon, and she refuses. She is knocked out. She wakes up, and there are 13 Black Aja and 13 Myrddrail. She channels, killing many of them, and she is able to because she hasn't taken the 3 oaths. She goes to her office. Find Beldine is stilled and has been tortured. She tells Egwene that they have taken Rand and are going to try him. Egwene goes to try to free him, is about to, and then sees the star and the arch and makes her way through. She then feels pain and light, and that is the end of the chapter. Boy, does that take a long time to summarize when there's a lot of plot. But sometimes that means we don't have as much to talk about. But somehow I think there's enough Egwene character moments in here for us to have a few things to talk about. Greg, this is our first time getting a repeat of a scene like this. We have seen Nynaeve's tested to become accepted, and now we see Egwene's. What were your thoughts on kind of the second pass through this ritual?
Whenever that happens, I always think the purpose is to note the differences, right? That an author, I tell my students this all the time when I teach them narrative. They want to just tell me, and that's the moment that changed my life and I loved it forever. And the old adage of like show, don't tell means the easiest way to do that is put your characters in a similar situation as they were in before and show us how they act differently. Yeah. Now, in this case, it's clearly 2 different characters. So it's more about how does this ritual treat people differently, or how do things act differently as a part of that? So what stands out is how, in some ways, the 3 tests were very similar. Yeah. I believe Nynaeve really had to forsake her connections once, but really all 3 of these seem to be about, will you actually do what has to be done and forsake Rand, not let your attachment. The Jedi don't believe in attachments, right? Is essentially what this is. And so she has to prove it 3 times in 3 different ways. So I think the repetition of the type of test stood out to me. And then the interference, which I have some theories on, but that seemed to be something is happening that is different here. And what could that possibly mean? And then my final thought is just that we've learned now more about the world of these Sangreal?
Terangreal.
Terangreal. And so I think the fact that we're really looking at these and we know that they use them for this purpose, but don't know what they're really doing, sure makes me think more about the last chapter. And are we verse jumping? Are we in other timelines? And what kind of wreckage are we leaving behind in these other timelines potentially?
Well, and you mentioned the kind of interference that goes on throughout this chapter, where I think we get in the second trip through, we see some kind of oddities, and then at the end of the third, we actually hear like voices seemingly from the other side of the arch arguing about whether it needs to be closed or whether they'll hold it open. And I thought that, like you said, worked really well in light of the previous chapter, right? It makes me start to question, are we in the world of dreams? Are we in another universe? Is the interference in some way related to the fact that we had a ring that interferes with the world of dreams in the same room as these arches? Like, I think this is one of those places where Robert Jordan does a really good job of not telling you what is happening, but giving you lots of options of what could happen. And that's really exciting as a first-time reader because you don't know. And it's really exciting as a kind of follow-up reader because you get the opportunity to say, like, here are the things that I thought pointed in another direction, and here's how they actually support what actually, was the case. And I find that to be just as fun of a game as what is coming up next.
So my candidates for the interference was the ring, right? Is this just, it made me think of my other podcasting co-host who will never listen to this, but hi Greg, in case you someday do. He always like pauses before we start recording and seeks out every electronic device in a 3-mile radius, it seems, and make sure it's off so that there's no buzz or hum on the microphones. Maybe some of our listeners are like, yeah, dummies, you should do that too. But it always stands out to me that, there's these ways in which things are literally operating on a frequency we don't necessarily perceive, but can cause interference in that way. And I think that's a good metaphor for how I interpret how these Terra Angreal may be interacting with each other.
Yeah.
My other candidate is just, we still haven't seen exactly how powerful Egwene is. Now, last time we saw Nynaeve channel within the Terra Angreal, and we knew that was supposed to be impossible. So it still feels like she's just like an overwhelming raw power.
Yep.
But Egwene in this one is the Amerlin seat, and that's not nothing. And so I want to think that there is a lot of power here, and maybe that kind of interference is that it doesn't know quite what to make of her type of power that she has.
Well, and as we're talking about all of this, what does the interference look like? Is this an alternate reality? Is this the world of dreams? What is causing Egwene or Nynaeve to be able to channel and Egwene to have this interference? All of that, I think we can kind of layer on top of that a question that was unresolved from when Nynaeve went through the arches, which is how accurate is what we see when we go through the arches, right? Nynaeve learned things and Egwene has learned things in the arches that turned out to be true, right? The fact that Egwene learned for the first time that people could be turned to the dark, and then she get pulled out and someone tells her that is actually the case, that I think should make us question, is Egwene going to become the Amerlin seat? Is someone named Beldine going to be of the Green Aja and be her friend / keeper? How much of what we're seeing here is a potential future or the actual future? And I think kind of bearing these sorts of questions in mind is a really tricky one, because if we're talking about alternate realities, that also does kind of mean it's a possible reality in where we currently are.
And I mean, this is the stupidest response to that I can imagine, but it's like, it's all in play, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I mean that those are all possibilities, and it's also possible that all are true. So I do think that, it's a masterful bit of writing to build. I mean, the goal of the chapter is to build on Egwene and her character and the choices she has to make, and flesh her out a little bit in ways that the boys kind of naturally get, that we haven't seen her always get the same attention. But to think about the ramifications, we'll call it, then makes it like, if you thought you could tune this out, you really can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a good example of that is in the first of the 3 visions that Egwene has. And we can start taking these a little bit chronologically. I think a really good example of this is when Rand comes into town and starts describing kind of what the world would look like if the Seanchan had not been pushed back from Falme, right? He starts describing the Seanchan kind of paying for women who can channel, the Aes Sedai trying to flee from the area, Aes Sedai being used in battle. And so that kind of starts to kind of tickle that, like, this feels realistic and accurate in a way that I think kind of highlights exactly what you're describing. I also just want to highlight this first vision, because if you have been watching the television show along with us for the past 4 weeks, you just saw a version of this scene on the television show. In the TV show, we see Rand being tempted with a quiet life in the 2 rivers with his daughter Joya and his wife Egwene, and now we see Egwene being tempted by a life of quiet in the 2 rivers with Rand as her husband and a daughter named Joya.
Arya. So we've seen this scene kind of adapted recently, and I think that's both worth calling out, and it's kind of interesting to think this is important for both of those characters in some way.
I was trying really hard not to cross the strands of the multiverse. And here you go, just saying it out loud. No, I really don't think that's a spoiler for the show and doesn't really break our rules, but you're right. And I mean, that is the classic role of the hero, right? If
Yeah.
you are going to be the hero, you sacrifice your domestic life. It's just how it is, right? You don't
Yep.
get to be the master of the local and the master of the universe. And so, to your point, it is the shared sacrifice both characters are making. Now, maybe on some kind of television program, they would be a much more established romantic couple than this kind of flirtatious. So, I would say, reading it here, it's more of a fantasy,
Yeah.
what she dreams her life could be versus, well, I mean, both are that, but Rand's, it's much more like, this is literally what we would be doing because
Yeah.
we've already been so so I think it felt a little different in this context.
Yeah.
But as soon as the scene started, it's like, well, the point is that you have to reject it, right? You have to
Right.
leave that behind.
Yeah, and I think that that is the interesting thing for me about this sequence in general, and we can talk about this here. You mentioned it earlier. Uh, Egwene is supposed to be tested on whether she can leave the bonds of her past life behind and become, do the duty she needs to as an Aes Sedai. And yet the bonds of her past life seem to be Rand and oh yeah, also Rand. And I'm not sure that's the ideal choice from Robert Jordan, although it is the 90s choice from Robert Jordan.
Yeah, I mean, it's like this conversation between Egwene and herself fails the Bechdel test,
Yeah.
in some bizarre way. So I do think it's too bad, but I think you're right. It's not that this would feel a piece with its time period, which to me gives it a little bit of an excuse. But at the same time, it's certainly something I am positive the show will make changes to because the show
100%.
seems conscious of having greater gender equality across its plot lines.
Well, and I think that's exactly how this should be, right? For those of us who are reading a book that can't change, the response should be like, this is less than ideal. Let's both critique it and recognize why it happened that way. But if you're making a television show, it's not a fixed thing. Change it. I think that sounds like exactly what we should be doing. So, yay. Any last thoughts on the first of these visions before we jump to the second?
Boy, the internet would not like to hear you say don't make changes or make changes to it. Right? Like,
I know.
It's such a common thing. And I understand when readers are so attached to something going particularly how it's always gone in their heads and in their hearts. But I think it is important that creators not be bound by something like that, but update our mythologies to reflect the world in which we live. Yeah, let's move on to number 2.
Yeah, so in this one, we don't get nearly as much detail. I think this was the shortest of the 3. It's like we're in the middle of war, bad things are happening. Rand is conveniently trapped under something that Egwene can't move, but he could if he wouldn't go mad. It kind of works for me, but for me, this is the kind of like I needed a third one on the list of 3.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of simple, right? Like
Right.
it's just let me express it this way. When I turned the page into this one, I was like so excited to see what this would be. And you kind of get the pieces of it immediately. And it's like, then it became like, well, let's just get through this one instead of like, what could this possibly be? Because it's clear from that moment, she's again making a choice. Do I save Rand? I think the book tries to redeem that repetition by having this piece come out about the 13 and the channeling. I think it wasn't totally successful for me as a redemption because it's like I knew there would be ways that he could turn dark. So it's not like I needed to have that spelled out to me. That's not to say Egwene knew, and maybe Egwene has a new reason to be afraid, as is seemingly the point here, and that line will echo in her mind. But yeah, I mean, well, and just to also know, Caemlyn's destroyed here, which we know the Aes Sedai and Caemlyn were breaking apart in the intervening weeks between books. So interesting to note that as well.
Yeah, I think that the thing that is interesting to me about the choice of kind of where is this set is that it's somewhere that we've been before, but interestingly, it's not somewhere that Egwene has been for anything longer than I think like 2 or 3 days before. So the fact that she recognizes it is just an interesting little kind of detail to have in there. The only other thing that I would say kind of in this section is just that I feel like when Egwene is talking about Rand and madness, this is the first time that we've really kind of gotten a detailed world building explanation of like, okay, how many people would it take to turn Rand to the dark? How does it work in terms of madness? If he channels too much, it seems like that makes things operate differently than a little bit here and there. And then all of this to some degree, I think is Robert Jordan just saying like, look, I have some medicine for you. You need this like world building detail for somewhere later down the line. And I think Robert Jordan is trying to sweeten that with like, oh, look, it's buried in this really interesting chapter of like these visions that are very exciting. And I just don't think he did a great job of it here, right? This is like the pill that my dog would spit out halfway through. He's like, no, I'm not actually going to eat this one. This isn't a very good treat.
Yeah, I found the peanut butter around the pill, not the pill.
Exactly.
So I have nothing to add to that about the second. So I will transition, but you can go back if you need to. I will just say that makes the third kind of great because the third actually delivers on the promise. It's like as it starts out and you're just like, whoa, damn, like this is her as the Amerlin seat, which is really exciting to think about. And my mind leaves this one going, are we seeing a future, the future? I think the language in this one felt slightly different in that Egwene is always kind of remembering her past in the plot line of the dream or the vision as well as the plot line of her own life. So it's like there's a double vision going on that she senses both, which to me made this feel more like a real thing. And what I mean by that, do I think she'll have to someday question whether or not she will gentle Rand? No, but I think she might be Amerlin's seat someday. And that, again, kind of played into this idea of we don't know the scope of her powers and how she might be alive in this. So that seemed really exciting to me.
Yeah, and I think what really works about this is that it kind of gives us this brief, really fascinating glimpse of like, what is this future for Egwene? And it gets us excited and it gets us really pumped. And then it immediately pulls the rug out from underneath us, right? Like in the first 2 or 3 pages of this, you're like, yeah, she is a baller. She is running the world. Like, this is the future I want for Egwene. And then immediately it's like, oh no, she is told she has to still Rand. When she refuses, she's knocked unconscious, finds out her number 2 was tortured and stilled, and has to lead a revolution against the Black Aja with a bunch of merge rail in the White Tower. Right. So it does this really effective job of, as you say, making us go like, this seems like a future that has a lot of power and influence. And I'm really curious to see if Egwene gets there. And then every time we get something that might potentially confirm, oh, yeah, she might become the Merlin one day, that's going to keep making us go, oh, but if she does that mean the rest of the vision is also going to come true?
Yeah. And I just want to add that it echoes something we saw in the television show in a lot of ways, but is not exactly the same thing, but thematically seems to be tied into that. So everything you just said, plus pulling that kind of dynamic in, and it's just really rich and it's really fun and exciting. And I guess my lingering question from it is her connection to the woman whose name you said
Beldine is how I've been pronouncing it. Yeah.
That was really curious. So that's not somebody we've met before, I'm
Correct.
assuming. And yet in that kind of double vision, it was like Beldine's acting weird. And it's like, I basically left this like, can't wait to meet that person and see how they connect to Egwene in some way, because I think that is another piece that might be pulled out of that. But, I take the sum of these three, especially the third one, to mean Egwene has a very big part to play in this story, and you should not think of her as the kid sister who tagged along, right?
100%. And if we're thinking about this as a vision that we want to be kind of keeping an eye on, is it coming true? What are the signs that it might be coming true? Looking for someone named Beldine, I think, is a really great place to start. And if we're thinking about kind of tracking Egwene's kind of path through the Aes Sedai, potentially to becoming the Merlin seat, one of the pieces of information that we get here is that Beldine, this potentially hypothetical character, is of the Green Aja, which means that Egwene would be raised of the Green Aja. So this might be something that we would be keeping an eye on going forward, is if Egwene decides to be of the Green, that might be our first kind of hint that at least parts of this vision are coming true.
There we go. I'm watching. I'm waiting. Can't wait to figure it out. And then all I have at the end is just like, it really seems like she barely made it back.
Yeah.
Not that I really thought she was in any danger, but the fact that she barely made it back to our continuing narrative, to me, means we should interpret this as there was real danger in what happened.
Yeah, and I think that fits with what we learned in the last chapter, right? If we are going to be dealing with a world of dreams where people can get scarred from spending a few extra minutes there, and then the Aes Sedai are simultaneously playing around with something that is either in that world or adjacent to it that they don't fully understand, yeah, that's terrifying. And the fact that she barely made it out, I think, is just going to make things, really interesting to see how people respond to that in future chapters. And next week, we've got 2 more chapters coming up. That is chapter 23, Sealed, and chapter 24, Scouting and Discoveries. And I've been looking ahead a little bit, as I am wont to do, because I know what is coming. And let me just say, we've got a couple more chapters where we're kind of building up the story, getting some world building going. But this story is just about to take off. So we've got some really good stuff coming very soon. And I'm going to leave that as a very cryptic hint, and Greg can take us out of the episode.
Is it a powder keg? Is it a roller coaster? Will we dive deep into our souls and find a third metaphor? Maybe one that's not cliche and used
it's
everywhere?
Not going to be the third one. It's one of the first 2.
Is Tylor's prophecy going to come true? Join us next time on Through the Glass Columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.